you so much for that, Rita. Hi everyone, thank you so much for coming. Before we begin today, we would just like to quickly do a kind of acknowledgement of country to the traditional owners of the land and recognise the continuing connection to land, water and culture. I'm currently on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. I further acknowledge the traditional owners of the country on which you are on and pay my respects to their elders, past and present, as well as any First Nations people here with us today. Particularly in this event, we want to acknowledge that First Nations peoples have had their own ways of doing justice for tens and thousands of years. So by way of introduction, my name is Brenda. I've got Anna over here. We're both from an organisation called the Survivor Hub. So for those who don't know us, we're a fairly new organisation, but what we do is that we provide support groups and for survivors of sexual assault. We're really excited and grateful to be here today, and really thankful to Transforming Justice Australia and Open Circle for sharing the wisdom and experiences on restorative justice, and also all our fantastic panel members who have so much experience in this area. Before I guess we go into the actual discussion, I might do just a quick introduction of all our panel members as well. Firstly, we've got Dr. Jane Belatho. Jane lives in Aotearoa and is an associate professor at the Diana Unwin Chair in Restorative Justice. She's also the director of Te Narapara Centre for Restorative Justice at Te Haringa Waka, or the University of Victoria, Wellington in New Zealand. Her work focuses on all forms of restorative justice practice, experiences of justice and injustice, and criminal justice reform. She's also a trained mediator with membership of Resolution Institute and has worked as a youth justice conference convener. We've also got Kate Christensen here today. She is a Wurundjeri woman who was born and raised on Jaja Wurrung country in central Victoria. She works as a restorative justice conference facilitator with Open Circle. She has extensive experience working with the domestic violence sector, supporting women who have experienced violence and crisis, and facilitating healing groups for women. She has facilitated and contributed to the development of Making Amends, which is a pilot program for fathers who've used violence in the family home. We've also got Thea Deacon-Greenwood here. She's a former community lawyer who spent 15 years working with families and individuals impacted by sexual violence, child sexual assault and family violence. Thea holds a Master's in Criminology and a Churchill Fellowship on victim-oriented restorative justice programs for sexual abuse. Thea is one of the founders of Transforming Justice Australia as well. We've also got Renee Hansaker here. Renee is a restorative justice facilitator and a practice leader at Open Circle. She's facilitated restorative justice processes involving survivors of sexual assault and persons directly responsible for the harm, as well as survivors of institutional sexual abuse and leaders of institutions responsible for harm. Renee has a Master's of Narrative Therapy and a background in counselling and social work. Last but not least, we've also got Nerita Lewis. Nerita is a co-founder and the manager of Open Circle, a restorative justice practice that is part of the Centre for Innovative Justice at RMIT University. Nerita is a former lawyer who worked in therapeutic courts, including the assessment and referral court, as specialist list responding to people with serious mental health diagnoses and cognitive disabilities, and the Neighbourhood Justice Centre, a holistic court and social services centre in Collingwood, Melbourne. Nerita also represented victim survivors of sexual violence and victims of crime compensation applications as well. I guess that's really it for introductions. I'm going to pass over to Anna, who will sort of facilitate largely most of the conversation today. I'm probably just going to pop out of the screen and just go to my computer and watch from that side. So yeah, over to you.
Thanks, Brenda. So we'll start from the basis. So the first question is to Jane, and could you explain to us what restorative justice is and what it can offer as a response to sexual violence?
Yeah, thanks, Brenda. Hi, everyone. Most simply, restorative justice is the creation of a space for conversation between people that have been harmed and people that are responsible. So between victims and offenders, or persons harmed and perpetrators. It's a facilitated conversation, and the facilitator can go by lots of different names: convener, elder, circle keeper, facilitator. And there can be lots of confusions about what restorative justice is, because it can look quite different in different parts of the world and in different applications. So restorative justice can be used within the legal system, and it can be used alongside the legal system, and it can be used totally in the community, which is what we'll talk a bit about this afternoon. It's an idea that gained traction kind of from the 1970s onwards. And when I say that it's a facilitated conversation, it's kind of structured loosely in a way to talk about what happened, and then the impacts, and then the potential ways forward. In terms of what it can offer victims and survivors of sexual violence, it's restorative justice and restorative practices generally. They offer a different pathway to justice. For some, it might be a pathway to healing. For many, it's a pathway to voice, to accountability, to having some acknowledgement. It's a pathway where that kind of encourages responsibility taking, whether it be by one person, the perpetrator, or by up to kind of whole systems and institutions that might have had a role. I might leave it there and hope that somebody else will add on to that. Thanks.
Thanks, Jane. Is there anybody that did want to add on to that before we move on to the next question? Obviously it's related, but anything to add? No, perfect. Okay, so the next question is to Renee. Renee, you've worked with many victim survivors, both those seeking processes with the person directly responsible and those seeking responses from institutions who allowed the harm to occur. What are some of the things those victim survivors wanted?
Thanks, Hannah. Yeah, I suppose the first thing I would say is that, you know, as with any community, victim survivors are diverse, and so they have a really broad range of needs and interests, differing hopes, different justice needs, different ideas of kind of what justice is, different things that might be healing for one might not be healing for another. So it really is about acknowledging and recognising the diversity of what people are seeking and interested in as a first step. I suppose an idea that we really draw on in our work, and I think this is probably across both Transforming Justice Australia and Open Circle, is the idea of victim survivors' justice needs. And so what that really is, there's been a lot of research done, and what this kind of says is that there are sort of some things that that are pretty common, I suppose, for victim survivors of sexual harm, sexual violence, to be looking for after an experience of sexual harm. So some of these, Jane mentioned these before, it might be that the victim survivor wants to tell their story in their own way, using their own words, on their own terms, what that looks like, and to be heard. So not just to tell it, but to have that kind of, to have the other person listen, acknowledge, validate, and respond potentially to that. I think another key thing that I hear a lot in the work is that it's really important for a victim survivor to have the other person who's caused the harm to really understand the impacts of the harm, because often I think that's, you know, the impacts are kind of invisible often to the person who has perpetrated the harm, and so to really be able to have that acknowledged in a really meaningful way. I would say also, I'd say a huge one, and this is particularly relevant when we talk about institutional abuse as well, is that victim survivors are often what we call is a prevention need. And so this is sort of idea is that they're invested in their suffering or their experience not being for nothing, and that it's used in the service of kind of social change or cultural change, so that they can ensure that what has happened to them doesn't happen to anyone else. So this can be true for even if you're just meeting with the person responsible, perhaps you might want them to understand what harm has been caused, so that it's more likely that person may not go out and do that again, or in the context of an institution, that the leaders of the institution really understand that, so they're better equipped to intervene or interrupt that harm within an institutional context. The other thing I would say that is common, a common need or interest for people, particularly in the context of sexual harm, is that there is some kind of either relationship repair, or, if repair is not appropriate, a resetting of those relationships, so that, you know, and this is particularly when the sexual harm has occurred within a family context, or even a small community. So someone might be clear, you know what, I don't actually want an apology. I don't even need them to understand the impacts, but I want to make sure that when we both walk into the supermarket together in the small community that we live in, that we are both on the same page about what happens then, and we can have a clear conversation about resetting those boundaries and expectations, which can really help alleviate someone's social anxiety in going out, that everyone has an agreement around what happens. Or it might be that you might even be interested in a restorative process that involves other members of your family, not necessarily the person who has perpetrated the harm, but you might have sort of you might be deeply disappointed or harmed by perhaps someone from your family's inaction, or that they didn't believe you, or something around there, that there might be some kind of relationship repair that might need to happen in the context of the family. The other thing that we often see, which again is, and so what I would say about these kinds of needs and interests is they're needs and interests that are not necessarily attended to by the criminal justice system. So that does a particular pathway and does a particular thing, but these things can often sit outside or alongside the criminal justice system. And so sometimes victim survivors, what we refer to as an information need. So again, they might not be interested in hearing an apology or having a conversation around particular things, but they might be kind of haunted by this question of why something, or they might just have a question that kind of is on a bit of a loop in their head, and they want to have a facilitated conversation that in some way helps them answer that question, so that they can make sense going into the future, of what happened and why. So yeah, I'd say the only other thing I would add is that people are seeking accountability in ways that aren't delivered by the criminal justice system. So that, best case scenario, if that's what people are looking for, it delivers punishment, but that doesn't necessarily equate to accountability for some people. And so, we'd be interested in people's own ideas or definitions of accountability, what that would look like, what would that mean for people? Are there particular actions that people are seeking that would demonstrate accountability? So they're some of the things. Anyone else want to add any? Sorry, Anna, I'm taking over. You go.
Well, does anybody want to add anything to that? I feel like that was a pretty comprehensive list, Renee. Thank you so much. That was really interesting, and I had no idea of at least half of those. So yeah, thank you. The next question is to Katie. Katie, why might restorative justice be particularly relevant to First Nations victim survivors?
Yeah, thanks, Anna. I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm joining you all from Jar Jar Wurrung country in Central Vic. So to think about why RJ might be really useful for First Nations women, if we think about since invasion, Aboriginal women or First Nations women have known sexual harm, sexual assault, rape from white men without being able to rely on their own laws or ways of justice to protect them or to meet their justice needs. And the system that has been set up to provide justice to women, as we all know, is actually then set up to further oppress and diminish First Nations women. So really continuing that genocidal work of the colonial project. So, you know, it's not a system that's really worked. We know that it doesn't work for women in general, but when we think about the context for, you know, First Nations women, it's actually like designed to keep harming and oppressing. So that's kind of something to keep in mind, that system is not really working. And we also need to keep in mind that Aboriginal women or First Nations women are like 3 to 8 times more likely to experience sexual assault than non-Aboriginal women. And we know that it's even higher than that because of the lack of reporting. And some of the barriers around that are around, you know, sexual abuse being really a taboo to talk about. You know, and we know how much shame affects everyone when it comes to talking about these sorts of things. But for First Nations women, there's an extra layer of not being able to talk about these things. There's the deep layer of mistrust that exists between First Nations folks and systems like police and even doctors. You know, that's really been born out of and continued on through that ongoing living in a colonial state. And yeah, there's just overall a real lack of trust. There's no real relationship between authorities and First Nations people. And we know that there's really no cultural safety. So there's a lot of barriers that exist around accessing regular justice, or as justice as we know it. And then there's the extra layer of if the person responsible is also Aboriginal, because the fact is that, you know, First Nations folks die in custody. They still die in custody at alarming rates. If you make a report to the police, then you're seen as striking out against your own community. And that's just really, so it's not just the regular kind of flat you know, kickback that you might get, but then you're actually harming a person of your community as well. And then there are so many, you know, stereotypes and misinformation around, you know, Aboriginal people and sexual assault. And so people are really reluctant to feed into those stereotypes. So there's a lot of things stopping First Nations folks from even reporting or, you know, getting to that, getting to the system, let alone what happens if they do and the kind of responses that we know that we're going to get. So, you know, there's a real need for self-determined responses, right, for our First Nations folks to really, we got the intimate knowledge of the protocols that need to be followed. We know what supports exist within our communities and who are the go-to people and what our justice needs and interests are. So, and we just know that there's no justice for us in a courtroom. So for this reason, you know, restorative practices can be a really good option, just for the fact that it removes it from the justice system for a start. So it's something that is already then put into the hands of the people who it belongs to. It also doesn't always require, as Renee touched on, talking about the incident. So, you know, if talking about it is a real taboo or it's against your protocols, you know, you can talk around it. And, you know, us First Nations folks love to talk around harmful stuff, you know, we'll allude to things, but don't want to talk about the actual incident. It's very shaming and it's not appropriate. So you can actually go through an RJ response or without actually having to name the stuff if you don't want to. So that can be really helpful. And then, of course, there's support. So you can bring in the support of your community or your family or whoever you might need to help get through that process, or whoever's appropriate. And I mean, there's probably endless ways that I could probably talk for an hour about all the different ways that restorative justice really works for Aboriginal people. I think it really fits in with our ethos of attending to harm, and it really fits into our ethos of community as well. But they're just a few things to consider as to why it would be good. And yeah, that's probably it for me. I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in with some extra info.
Thank you so much, Katie. And I could listen to you talk for hours about that. Thank you. The next question is Thea, Thea, you're a co-founder with Jane of Transforming Justice Australia. Can you tell us a little bit about your work, what survivor-oriented restorative justice means, and why you think it's necessary for restorative justice responses to sexual harm to be survivor-oriented?
Sure, thanks, Anna. So one of the reasons why we've started doing this work, and I started doing this work, is really from listening to my clients who are survivors of sexual abuse for many, many years, and listening to the things that they wanted and needed, and seeing them as experts in their lives, and seeing them as people with strength and incredible resilience, and often resistance. And really listening deeply to people over long periods of time. For a long time, I didn't realise that some of the things that they were wanting and needing were things that restorative justice could attend to in ways in which the kind of processes I've been trained in terms of, victim advocacy and engaging with the legal process can't really do in the same way. So it took me quite a long time really to understand that restorative justice was a way of responding to sexual abuse, particularly that was centred around the needs of survivors, and really does orient, in both of our practices, really does orient the whole process around what's meaningful for them, and seeing them as experts and core guides in the way in which we work. Renee kind of alluded to some of the flexibility that's in our processes, and I think that that's really true for both of us, particularly given that our services sit in a community space, so that we're not limited in terms of how long we might work with a victim survivor or person harmed, and we're also not limited by the number of people that we invite into a process to support them in having their needs met. And Renee also kind of alluded to the flexibility in terms of the way in which our processes have been set up, so that the dialogue or the process doesn't necessarily involve the harm doer. It might involve other people and their families. And so for both of our practices as well, values are really important in the way in which we work. So values of choice and accountability, listening to survivors' voice, taking their lead, flexibility, hope and dignity are really kind of core to the way in which we work. And for me personally, it's a kind of a fuller realization of the way in which I've been working as a lawyer in a community setting, but really coming together of a kind of, personal and professional values as well in the way in which we come to this work, and also the way many of us try to live our lives and hold other relationships as well. So victim or survivor-oriented restorative justice for us really means seeing survivors as experts in their lives and taking their lead, never approaching people unless we're invited to. Then that goes for our practice to other organisations and community groups and family groups as well. So that's the way in which we're survivor oriented, and we're also extremely flexible in the way in which we work. We don't run to timelines or deadlines or anything like that. And often our processes take, or community processes often take many months or years sometimes to develop. And we see those as real strengths, and being flexible is a real strength in this work. Yeah, I might leave it there, but I suppose I'll just close by saying that one of the reasons why Jane and I wanted to start this work is really to give survivors choice, and giving people choices alongside their information about legal rights and other types of compensation or support they might be seeking was really core to what we wanted to do, is just to create another choice for victim survivors and for communities. So thanks for the question, Anna. I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you. I love that response to that, and it's something that we talk about at the Survivor Hub all the time. Like, sexual violence in itself is having our choice taken from us, and here are these chances to have choice and to give that option back to people. So the next question is, it's not directed at a particular person, but I think Nerida, you might start. Victim survivors have fought hard for sexual violence to be recognised as a crime. Does using restorative justice risk re-privatising and decriminalising sexual violence?
Thanks so much for that question, Anna, and hello to the Survivor Hub community. It's a real pleasure to be with you today. I'm coming to you from Wurundjeri land. Yeah, I think I really just want to acknowledge that there can be a bit of fear and scepticism from the survivor community and from the sexual assault prevention and response sector. Initially, because there's the fear that, well, look, feminist survivors have fought so long and so hard to have sexual violence recognised as a crime, and policed properly and taken seriously, that having restorative justice, does that risk pushing it back into the private sphere and really take it away from that public realm? And does it let police and the court system off the hook? You know, can they, you know, not worry about not prosecuting really difficult cases and just say, okay, you know, victim survivors, you just get to have restorative justice? And I think those fears need to be addressed. And I think there is the potential for restorative justice to operate like that. But that's why it's so important, as you've heard from all my colleagues today, that if restorative justice is practiced in response to sexual violence, that it's victim survivor oriented and that they're not empty words, but that's actually how the programs are set up. So I think it's also really important to say that we advocate really strongly for restorative justice to be an additional option for victim survivors. So it's never there as saying, okay, either have the criminal justice system or have restorative justice. It's important. Oh, sorry, this is my cat Artemis who wanted to join our presentation. It's really important that victim survivors have more justice options open to them. Restorative justice is one, but there should be more and more, and we should keep thinking about what else could offer meaningful justice to victim survivors. So it's not about closing down options, it's about increasing them. And certainly at Open Circle, RJ is a possibility alongside a criminal prosecution. So it can be something in addition to reporting and through going through a prosecution that victims can choose to engage in. But I think it also really needs to be acknowledged that as we all know, you know, the vast majority of victim survivors choose not to report. And of those who do, you know, many experience a prosecution that is discontinued. So, or it's not brought, a report's made, but charges aren't brought. So I think for us, it's really important that those survivors have an option, have something additional that they might explore. And so, you know, for us, having RJ that people can engage with whether or not they choose to report is really crucial. And I think that we do need to continue to improve the formal system so that it needs to continually be made a better experience for victim survivors. But I don't think that is an argument against also providing restorative justice. And I think that even if the criminal justice system, you know, in utopian visions was one day operating always at best practice standards, even then, you know, as we know and as we've heard today, you know, victim survivors are so diverse, and even if it was operating really well and it wasn't imbued with rape myths and it was a much more respectful process, there would still be some survivors that wouldn't find that their needs were met through that process. So I think, yeah, I think RJ needs to be there. And as we heard from Katie, there are some communities that the justice system just doesn't work for. So I think the more options we can provide, as long as they're victim survivor oriented, the better, and the more choices that we make possible for victim survivors to experience justice, the better. I think another point too is to really emphasise that it's voluntary. So it's something that's there that responds to victim survivors and adds to a victim survivor's capacity to choose the justice response that best meets their needs. It should be never something that someone is forced or coerced into doing because it might be easier for the justice system, for example. Yeah, so that's what I wanted to say. Maybe some of my colleagues would like to also offer a response.
No. Okay, so that was kind of the main questions that we prepared. We have some questions from the Survivor Hub community sent to us before, but before I ask them, Narita, did you have a phone number that people could text questions to? Do you mind maybe repeating it, and then anybody who has a question can write it down or text now?
Fantastic, thanks, Anna. Yes, please do text in. We've had to, well, we decided to not enable the chat function to protect people's privacy, but we'd love to hear from you. So please text 0428 134 736, and I'll repeat that, 0428 134 736, and that's the Open Circle number for future reference. But yeah, please text in, and we'll try to cover as many questions as we can.
Great, thanks, Nerida. So the first question from the Survivor Hub community, it's a few questions in one. How would restorative justice work when the impact of sexual violence is often on someone's ability to function on a day-to-day basis, which can then impact on a person's ability to work, etc.? How does it help a survivor deal with these far-reaching impacts, especially when they're not always seen straight away? Anybody can jump in and answer that one.
You want to go, Thea? Me? You go, Thea.
Yeah. No, up to you.
Oh. First of all, thank you for the question. I think it is really important to acknowledge the far-reaching impacts of sexual harm, and that it's really important in any process that we were going to facilitate that we think about structuring safety into that.
Mm-hmm.
And what that means for different people looks different, but it's about having a number of conversations over time with their important support people or people meaningful to them around, one, how do we manage these unwanted impacts or intrusions in their life? How can we kind of how can the person move through this process alongside those impacts? What sort of skills and knowledges do they know of themselves that actually counteract these impacts? So, they will be, again, the expert in their own life, and they will have knowledge about how to minimize these impacts. But the other thing I would say is that sometimes timing is really important in these processes. So it may not be the right time for that person. And so that is part of the conversation too. So really important to be clear about when we're talking about a facilitated conversation, we're never just kind of getting people say, yeah, okay, yeah, I'll have one of those, and we kind of come together next week. As Thea mentioned, the preparation phase before we would actually ever bring anyone together, a facilitated conversation, can be months, can sometimes be years, where we're moving back and forward, and all the way through that process, we're structuring safety for that person. Anyone else want to add anything?
I was only going to add, Renee, that the question I think also really wonderfully kind of brings out the fact that people have got different needs at different times, and often in the kind of immediate after an assault or a trauma, people have a real need for safety, and to have people around them that they trust and that they can go to. And it's often for most of the time anyway, the matters that we see most often is that the harm has passed. There's been quite a lot of time. People have had some time to get support in place. They've had some time to reflect about the impact of what's happened. And so that timing question is a really personal one. And as Renee said, a lot of work is done by the facilitator and the team to make sure that the timing is right, and that question of readiness is kind of really been really well thought out, and a lot of attention to safety and well-being has been given. I guess I was only going to add that just because a matter is eligible for a restorative process, it doesn't necessarily mean it's suitable. And so the process of doing an intake is also us speaking with the person who's been harmed and whoever else is in their support network, and then taking a really careful approach to working out whether or not this process is likely to meet their needs. And if the things that they're wanting to achieve aren't likely to come through this restorative process, being really clear that people don't have expectations that can't be met. So being really open and transparent about what's possible and what's not is also really important. And we would do that intake process with anybody else that's coming into any restorative process, including a harm doer. So yeah, I just thought I'd add that a question about eligibility doesn't necessarily mean suitability for restorative.
That's a really interesting point as well, because it's something that I wish they could do in the legal process, because I think they make a lot of promises to you in the beginning and they don't tell you what you're looking for, and yeah, it would have made a lot of difference for a lot of people. The next question is, how can we ensure that victim survivors are not being coerced into restorative justice by family members if the perpetrator is within the family and the family does not want them to formally report?
Katie, do you want to go? I'll just put you in the hot seat.
Yeah, thanks, Nerida. You know, I think one of the first things that we're always keeping in mind is to do no further harm. And part of that is when we're doing intake, and as Thea and Renee were both talking about, we're really exploring what people's hopes for the process is, what their goals are, and what things are really precious and important to them that is going to sort of structure that safety and carry them through, you know, with a strong story. And so during that process, I think it's going to come out whether someone's being coerced. You know, a lot of us have backgrounds within, you know, domestic violence, and that's so we're well aware of the sort of tactics and things that get used. And we wouldn't be bringing, like Renee said, people aren't together in the same room from the get-go. So we're spending a lot of time one-on-one with both sides, and we're pretty alive to tactics of coercion. And I think just talking about people's hopes and, you know, and values will really expose whether someone is being coerced. And it is ultimately a voluntary process. And we're very clear about that for both sides. People can drop out at any point, really. So, you know, we're always checking and making sure that that this is a process that people want to see through, because we really don't ever want to do any further harm. I don't know if anyone wants to add anything to that.
I was just going to jump in and add a little bit, just because I think it is an important part of our framework, is that we actually engage accountability specialists into our processes that involve sexual harm. So these are really experienced professionals who have a long history in working with people responsible for gender and sexual violence, and working around kind of invitations to responsibility and accountability. And so we do use those accountability specialists both as a secondary consult, so we can ring them up before or after we speak with someone and we say, you know, this is the context, this is what we're hearing, what are the red flags, what can we reasonably predict, what should we be on the lookout for? So we use them in that capacity. We also invite them into the process sometimes, and so they can travel along the process with us and join conversations with the person responsible, or they can have separate conversations with the person responsible. And really the purpose of that is, if the victim survivor is looking for, I want the person to really understand and be able to acknowledge and be accountable, then we will have conversations with that person to try and, I suppose, push them as far along that accountability spectrum that's possible, or invite, if you like, as opposed to push. And so, yeah, I suppose that's just another kind of accountability mechanism that we have to our own process to buffer against us being co-opted by victim blaming or myths and misconceptions, or grooming, or any of those things that can kind of, yeah, happen when we're working with people who have enacted sexual violence.
Great, thanks Katie and Renee. Nerida, do you want to read out the mobile number just one more time in case somebody's had any questions pop up from those answers? Sorry.
Yes, absolutely. No, I think that's a great idea. So I'll read it out again. 0428 134 736. That's 0428 134 736. And we've actually had some really fantastic questions come through. So I'm going to start with one that, and they're really lovely messages, thank you. One, I think there's a fairly short answer. So a participant who lives in New South Wales who's interested in exploring RJ has been in touch. So to answer your question, Transforming Justice Australia, so that's Thea who's presenting today, and Jane, their organisation would be the best point of contact. So that's Transforming Justice Australia. I might ask if the wonderful directors of the Survivor Hub can do a follow-up post with all of our contact details. But yeah, for those of you in New South Wales, Transforming Justice Australia is your point of contact, and Katie, Renee and myself are from Open Circle in Melbourne, and we're available to respond to sexual violence that's occurred in Victoria. So Victorian listeners can be in contact with us. We can also provide some information about different places if you're in different parts of the country. And perhaps if that's okay with the Survivor Hub, we could work with them to put up that information. Some other questions, and there's one that's just come through that I might read out and then answer. So we've got one from somebody who has experience both as a survivor and as a lawyer working in the criminal justice system. And they ask, am I correct in saying that at the moment RJ processes are not recognised by the formal court process? So I think that depends on where you are in Australia. So if you're in the ACT, it is a legislated program and it can formally connect to the justice system. In Victoria, we're working on it, and my organisation's currently working with Victoria Police on a formal trial about linking into the formal justice system and having those connections. Our Law Reform Commission recommended that RJ be available in connection with a criminal trial. So I think it's happening, and we've already run processes at Open Circle just in collaboration with other justice system agencies that have made it possible to go ahead in tandem with a criminal trial. Does anyone from TJA want to add to that from a New South Wales perspective?
Sure, thanks, Narita. I'll just add 2 points maybe. One is that post-conviction restorative justice processes are possible through a unit within the Department of Corrective Services. So there is a post-conviction process that it currently exists, and we can obviously share some information with you, Anna, about that too. I guess I'd also just add that youth justice conferencing is a restorative justice process for young people, but sexual offences can't be conferenced through that process. But there's also no reason why a restorative justice conference couldn't take place or process couldn't take place alongside a criminal process in New South Wales. There's actually a process within the bore people with legislation, but in terms of the criminal process, if somebody's pled guilty, a matter can actually be referred to any type of process, including a restorative one, which would sit alongside a criminal process pre-sentencing. So that's not necessarily the most ideal time for a number of reasons, which we could talk more about, but there's no reason why a matter couldn't be referred to our service or another restorative process alongside the criminal legal system. I don't know if anybody wanted to add to that, but Narita's 100% in saying that the only state with legislation is, territory with legislation is the ACT. Did anybody want to add to that, or have I just created a whole extra layer of confusion there?
Just that in Queensland and South Australia, in the youth justice conferencing schemes, there have been times in history where you could attend a conference for a sexual assault matter. So there's a little bit of research and evidence around that.
We're getting some really fantastic questions texted through, and I hope we have time to answer them all. Can I say that if we don't, we'll really have a look at what we didn't get to, and we're really happy to do a follow-up session, or the panel members could record a conversation and post it to Survivor Hub Media, or everyone here is really, really welcome to contact our organisations directly. But some great comments that are coming through are questions. One, the question is, does the perpetrator have to plead guilty for restorative justice? And I'll answer that sort of directly from Open Circle's perspective. No, they don't. And our aim is that restorative justice can be available as well as a criminal prosecution, or it can be available in circumstances where a victim survivor chooses not to report. So if she chooses not to report, obviously there's no criminal process and there's no plea of guilty. So that's the answer to that. But then we're getting some related questions about what if the perpetrator doesn't take responsibility and does not admit accountability. I think that is the more pertinent question in a way that is hard to grapple with. And I'll say to open it up, it is a requirement that the perpetrator will agree. And as you've heard from my colleagues, it's voluntary. But maybe I'll open it up a bit more to our practitioners about what that willingness looks like. Because as we've heard from Thea in their program and Renee in ours, there is work to get somebody to that point where they can truly step into accountability. But yeah, can my colleagues talk to that a little bit about what is necessary as a starting point in terms of accountability and acceptance of responsibility?
Sure. Yeah, so I mean, I think essentially a starting point of restorative justice is that someone is willing to step into some form of accountability or responsibility for the harm, and that it's not a space for the harm to be contested or disputed in some way. So it wouldn't be about sort of a mediation conversation where you might be kind of contesting sort of facts or things like that. So it is, it does have a different frame to it. So ideally, yes, one, you know, it's voluntary and consent-based. So the person does have to be able to step in and say, yes, I'm willing to be a part of this conversation. And ideally, they are at least there's a thread or some sort of flicker or flame of something to work with there around their acceptance of being able to listen, of being able to hear, of being able to participate responsibly and accept responsibility. The thing I would say, though, is that it is also important as to what the victim survivor is seeking. And so if, you know, as I mentioned before, they actually just want to ask a question or they just want to negotiate who comes to the family Christmas next year or something like that, it might be less necessary, I suppose, for someone to be really stepping into that accountability and responsibility. So it is a bit dependent on what are the goals and interests and needs of the victim survivor, and can we get a match? So is there alignment from the person responsible in what they're being able to step into and participate in? And if there is that alignment, then usually we can take the next step. Anyone else want to add?
I was only going to add, if that's okay, that some of the kind of useful mentoring that we've had from other organisations is also to understand accountability taking as a journey, and that an invitation to somebody to be accountable and to participate in this process doesn't necessarily mean that you know, a face-to-face conference is going to be the outcome, but that if there's an opening there, as Renee was saying, if there's an opening for somebody to participate, it might be that through this process we scaffold additional support around them to support them in their accountability journey. So I just thought I'd add that there's support available for harm doers as well, if there's an openness and a willingness for them to participate in the process.
Thank you. Having lots of really great questions come through, and I'm sorry that I'm not getting to all of them, but I'll just have another look now. There's one person who's texted in, as you heard Thea say, not all processes have to result in a face-to-face meeting to be beneficial, but this person's asked, and I think they might be interested in taking part in an RJ process, but they've asked, does it have to be a face-to-face format? And I think I can answer this quite simply from Open Circle's perspective, is that no, it doesn't, and that's one option, but that flexibility that you've heard everyone talk about today means that you know, as long as everyone can agree what the format is up to the victim survivor. So we've definitely worked with people who've preferred a letter exchange, and there's still all that support, and the exchange is still facilitated, and there's still accountability work done with the perpetrator, but it can be via letter. You know, post-COVID, so much is online, so we can, you know, we can do a lot of the preparation with the survivor and indeed with the perpetrator online, and there could be an online meeting if that worked for the victim survivor. So definitely the form that facilitated dialogue takes can be really tailored to what's going to work for that person. I just wanted to share with the group another question that's come in that I might direct to Jane, if that's okay. With your research background, with your research expertise, this is a question that says, do you think restorative justice has a better chance of stopping reoffending than the formal criminal justice system? And Jane, can you talk to restorative justice and the connection between RJ and reoffending?
Yeah, so there, I mean, there at this point there's not a huge amount of hardcore gold star evidence in terms of sexual assault and restorative and reoffending. There is some good evidence in kind of in other areas, but what I would say is that for the reasons articulated earlier by you, Narita, that many cases don't even get many cases aren't reported, so there's nothing's happening for the perpetrator there. Many cases don't kind of get prosecuted. Again, nothing's happening to stop the kind of behaviours for the person responsible. And even for the ones that do progress through the legal system and even to a guilty and perhaps even to a prison sentence, there's quite limited availability of in-prison therapeutic tailored programs for people that have perpetrated sex offending that actually make a substantive difference in terms of research-wise. So yes, restorative does have a role to play, because in many restorative schemes that in this particular space, the people responsible are working with those specialist accountability specialists, and that is specialised support that you don't get through the legal system, whether it's to get into the facilitated dialogue and there's that support there, or whether it's through the journey, or whether it's afterwards that somebody agrees to actually stay connected to a therapeutic support kind of group or some such. Somebody's getting that quite tailored, specific support that you wouldn't get through the legal system. So yeah, I am quite hopeful about its potential, though we do need to kind of study it to find out specifically.
Thanks so much, Jane. Anna, I might hand back to you. I'm conscious that we're approaching the end of our time. There are a few messages I haven't gotten to, I'm so sorry, but I will follow up personally, and we'll talk about whether we might do another session if there's the interest, or find some way of keeping the dialogue going. But I'll hand back to Anna, and I'm not sure if Anna had further questions for the panel before we wrap up.
Well, I have a bunch of questions now, but I will also save them till after the panel so that we're not running over time. But I just want to say thank you to everybody. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and your experience with all of us today. And I'm really excited that you got a lot of interesting questions in over text, and I'm looking forward to talking to you, Narita, about how we can answer them and get those answers out to the people who are asking the questions. So thank you so much, everybody.